The detectives found the hard drives first. 17 of them. Stacked in a cardboard box beneath Stephen Stern's bed, wrapped in old t-shirts like they were something precious. Something worth protecting. When the forensic team powered them up, they discovered over 1,400 files, images and videos spanning years. A digital archive of horror that documented every stage of a child's stolen innocence, catalogued with the meticulous care of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Madeline Soto was 13 years old when her body was found in a wooded area off Hickory Tree Road in St. Cloud, Florida. She had been dead for hours by the time her mother reported her missing. But the real truth that would emerge in the investigation was that Madeline had been dying for years, slowly, invisibly, in a bedroom upstairs while her mother slept downstairs, trusting the man she loved to keep her daughter safe. This is the story of how a predator hides in plain sight, how a child's silence becomes their prison, and how the people meant to protect them can become the architects of their destruction. Let's go back to the beginning. Kissimmee, Florida. February 2024. On the surface, the Soto household looked unremarkable. A modest home in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bikes and families waved to each other from driveways. Jen Soto, Madeline's mother, worked hard to provide for her daughter. She had been in a relationship with Stephen Stearns for years, an on-again, off-again partnership that had recently solidified when Stearns moved back into the home. Madeline was a quiet girl. Teachers described her as withdrawn but polite. She had friends, but not many close ones. She spent most of her time at home, often in her room, often alone with Stearns while her mother worked long shifts. To the outside world, this seemed normal. A stepfather figure helping to care for a teenage girl, a family unit functioning as families do. But inside that house, in the hours when no one was watching, something else was happening. Stephen Stearns was 37 years old. Unremarkable in appearance. The kind of man who blends into crowds, who doesn't draw attention. He worked in IT, understood technology, knew how to hide digital footprints. He was patient, methodical, and he had been grooming Madeline Soto since she was 8 years old. The abuse didn't start with violence. It never does with predators like Stearns. It started with boundary violations so subtle they seemed like affection. A hand on the shoulder that lingered too long. Sitting too close during movie nights. Private jokes that made Madeline uncomfortable, but that she couldn't articulate why. Gifts that came with unspoken expectations. Compliments that felt wrong but sounded kind. By the time Madeline was 10, Stearns had normalized his presence in her most private spaces. He would enter her room without knocking. He would insist on helping her with things she could do herself. He created a dependency, a sense that his attention was both inevitable and inescapable. And then, slowly, the touching began. Madeline never told anyone. This is the part that haunts investigators. The silence. But anyone who understands trauma knows that silence isn't consent, it's survival. Madeline was a child living with her abuser. She had nowhere to run. No framework to understand what was happening to her. And Stearns, like all skilled predators, had taught her that speaking would only make things worse. He told her it was normal. That this was what families did. That her mother wouldn't understand. That she would be taken away if anyone found out. That it was their secret, and secrets were how you showed love. And Madeline, because she was a child, believed him. By the time she turned 13, the abuse had escalated to rape. Regular, documented, filmed rape that Stearns stored on those hard drives like trophies. He had created a routine. He knew when Jen would be asleep. He knew when Madeline would be most vulnerable. He had turned the upstairs bedroom into a crime scene that reset itself every morning, leaving no visible evidence except the psychological fractures deepening inside a child who had learned to dissociate just to survive each night. But something was changing in Madeline. She was getting older, developing her own sense of self, beginning to understand in fragments that what was happening to her wasn't normal, wasn't love, was in fact destroying her from the inside out. In the weeks before her death, Madeline had started to pull away. Small acts of resistance. Locking her door, spending more time at friends' houses. Talking less to Stearns. These were tiny rebellions, but to a predator who had spent years constructing total control, they were threats. Stephen Stearns was losing his grip on Madeline Soto, and he couldn't allow that. February 26, 2024. The day Madeline disappeared. The timeline that would later emerge in court documents reveals a sequence of events so calculated, so coldly executed, that it defies the image of a crime of passion. This was not a moment of rage. This was a decision made by someone who had already crossed every moral boundary and saw murder as simply the next logical step in maintaining control. That morning, Jen Soto woke up expecting a normal day. Madeline was supposed to go to school. Stearns had offered to drive her, as he often did. Jen was tired from working late. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He had been part of their lives for years. He had helped raise Madeline. He was family. She went back to sleep. Stephen Stearns and Madeline Soto left the house together around 8 a.m. Surveillance footage from a nearby church captured Stearns' vehicle driving past. Madeline was in the passenger seat. This would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. But Madeline never made it to school. Instead, Stearns drove to a secluded area. What happened in those hours remains partially obscured by the limits of forensic evidence. But the autopsy would later reveal the truth written on Madeline's body. She had been strangled. The medical examiner determined that she died from asphyxiation, likely manual strangulation. A method that requires sustained pressure, sustained intent, sustained presence while a child fights for breath and then stops fighting. Stearns killed Madeline Soto in the morning hours of February 26th. Then he disposed of her body in a wooded area off Hickory Tree Road in St. Cloud, roughly 30 miles from their home. He chose a location that was isolated but accessible. A place where he could move quickly. He left her there, partially concealed by vegetation, and drove back home. When Jen Soto woke up later that day and asked where Madeline was, Stearns told her he had dropped her off at school. He lied with the same ease he had lied for years. But this time, the lie had an expiration date. When Madeline didn't come home that afternoon, Jen began to worry. She called the school. They had no record of Madeline attending that day. She called Stearns. He maintained the story. He had dropped her off near the school, watched her walk toward the building. Maybe she had skipped. Maybe she was with friends. Jen called the police. The Kissimmee Police Department initiated a missing persons investigation. They interviewed Stearns. He was calm, cooperative, concerned. He repeated his story. He had dropped Madeline off. He had no idea where she was now. He wanted to help find her. But investigators noticed something. Stearns' timeline didn't match the surveillance footage. The church cameras showed his vehicle driving in the opposite direction from the school. When confronted with this discrepancy, Stearns adjusted his story. He said he had gotten confused about the route. He said he might have taken a different way. He said he was stressed and couldn't remember clearly. The lies were beginning to fracture. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Stearns' vehicle. Inside, they found evidence that would later be described in court documents as biological material consistent with decomposition. They found Madeline's belongings. They found signs of a cleanup attempt, bleach residue, disturbed upholstery, missing floor mats. And then they found the hard drives. When forensic analysts began reviewing the contents, they discovered a horror that extended far beyond a single day. The files dated back years. They showed Madeline at different ages, in different stages of abuse, in her own bedroom, in the house where she was supposed to be safe. The metadata on the files revealed that Stearns had been documenting his crimes with the thoroughness of someone who never expected to be caught. The most recent files were from the days immediately before Madeline's death. Investigators realized they weren't just looking at a murder case. They were looking at years of systematic sexual abuse that had culminated in homicide. Madeline Soto hadn't just been killed. She had been tortured for years, and when she finally began to resist, her abuser had eliminated her. On February 28, 2024, 2 days after Madeline was reported missing, her body was found in St. Cloud. The medical examiner confirmed her identity through dental records. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The manner of death was homicide. Stephen Stearns was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and multiple counts of sexual battery on a child under 12. But the investigation was far from over. The interrogation footage is difficult to watch. Stephen Stearns sits across from detectives in a small room. He is calm, almost unnaturally calm. His hands are folded on the table. His voice is steady. He maintains eye contact. He looks like someone who has practiced this moment in his mind, who has prepared for the possibility of being caught, who believes he can still control the narrative. The detectives lay out the evidence piece by piece. The surveillance footage. The biological material in his vehicle. The inconsistencies in his timeline. Stearns responds with more lies, each one more elaborate than the last. He suggests alternative explanations. He implies that Madeline might have run away. He hints at other suspects. He performs the role of a concerned stepfather with the precision of someone who has been performing for years. Then the detectives mention the hard drives. For the first time, Stearns' composure cracks. It's subtle, a slight shift in his posture, a momentary break in eye contact, a pause before he speaks. He asks for a lawyer. The interrogation ends. But the evidence speaks louder than any confession. Forensic analysis of the hard drives revealed over 1,400 images and videos, documenting the sexual abuse of Madeline Soto. The files showed a progression of abuse that began when Madeline was approximately 8 years old and continued until days before her death. The content was so disturbing that investigators required psychological support to complete the review. The files also revealed something else. Stearns had been meticulous about hiding his crimes. He used encryption. He stored files across multiple devices. He deleted and reformatted drives regularly. But he had made one critical mistake: he had kept copies. Perhaps as insurance. Perhaps as trophies. Perhaps because, like many predators, he couldn't resist revisiting his crimes. That compulsion to preserve evidence would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. As investigators dug deeper into Stearns' background, they discovered a pattern. He had been in previous relationships with women who had young daughters. He had always positioned himself as a helpful father figure. He had always sought access to children. The relationship with Jen Soto wasn't random, it was strategic. Madeline had been his target from the beginning. Jen Soto, when confronted with the evidence, was devastated. She had trusted Stearns. She had allowed him into her home, into her daughter's life. She had believed his lies. The guilt would be something she would carry for the rest of her life, even though investigators made clear that she was not complicit in the abuse. She had been deceived by someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. But there was another layer to this case that made it even more disturbing. The autopsy revealed that Madeline had been sexually assaulted shortly before her death. The timeline suggested that Stearns had abused her one final time before killing her. This wasn't a murder committed in panic or rage. This was a murder committed by someone who had taken what he wanted from his victim, and then eliminated her to avoid consequences. Madeline Soto's last hours were spent in the presence of the person who had tormented her for years. She knew what he was capable of. She knew there was no escape. And when he wrapped his hands around her throat, she knew exactly who was killing her and why. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of a predator who operated with cold calculation. Stearns had no history of impulsive violence. He had no criminal record. He had maintained employment, relationships, a facade of normalcy. He was the kind of predator who is hardest to detect, the one who hides behind respectability, who grooms not just victims but entire families, who understands that the best camouflage is ordinariness. And he had almost gotten away with it. If Madeline had been just a little younger, if she hadn't started to resist, if Stearns had been more careful with his digital evidence, this case might have remained hidden. Madeline might have continued to suffer in silence until she aged out of his interest, at which point he would have moved on to another victim, another family, another child. Instead, his need for control led him to murder. And murder, unlike abuse that happens behind closed doors, leaves evidence that can't be hidden forever. The legal proceedings moved slowly, as they always do in cases involving child victims and extensive digital evidence. Stephen Stearns was held without bond. The charges against him expanded as investigators reviewed the full scope of the evidence. In addition to first-degree murder, he faced 60 counts of sexual battery on a child under 12, multiple counts of possession of child sexual abuse material, and other related charges. The prosecution built a case that was overwhelming in its detail. They had the hard drives. They had the surveillance footage. They had the forensic evidence from Stearns' vehicle. They had the autopsy results. They had testimony from investigators, forensic analysts, and medical examiners. They had a timeline that placed Stearns with Madeline at the time of her death and showed him disposing of her body. There was no reasonable doubt. In July 2025, facing the certainty of conviction and the possibility of the death penalty, Stephen Stearns entered a no-contest plea to the murder charge and multiple counts of sexual battery. The plea deal spared him the death penalty but ensured he would never leave prison. The judge sentenced him to 21 consecutive life sentences. During the sentencing hearing, the judge read a statement that captured the enormity of Stearns' crimes. He described the abuse as systematic torture and the murder as the final act of control by a predator who saw a child as property. He noted that Madeline had been robbed not just of her life but of her childhood, her innocence, her sense of safety in her own home. Jen Soto did not attend the sentencing. She had given a statement to the court through her attorney, expressing her grief and her guilt. She said she would spend the rest of her life wondering how she had missed the signs, how she had failed to protect her daughter. She said she hoped that Madeline's story would help other parents recognize the warning signs of abuse. But the truth is that predators like Stephen Stearns are experts at hiding. They don't look like monsters. They look like boyfriends, stepfathers, coaches, teachers, neighbors. They are patient. They are strategic. They groom entire families, not just their victims. And by the time the abuse is discovered, the damage is already done. Madeline Soto's case sparked conversations about child safety, about the warning signs of grooming, about the importance of teaching children that they have the right to say no to adults, even adults they trust. Advocacy groups used her story to push for stronger laws around child sexual abuse material and for better training for teachers and social workers in recognizing signs of abuse. But for Madeline, these conversations came too late. She died at 13 years old after years of suffering that no child should ever endure. She died at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect her. She died because a predator decided that his desire for control was more important than her life. And she died in silence, just as she had lived. The hard drives are still in evidence storage, sealed, cataloged, a digital monument to evil that will never be destroyed because it serves as proof of crimes that must never be forgotten. Sometimes investigators wonder what would have happened if Madeline had been able to speak. If she had told a teacher, a friend, anyone. If someone had noticed the signs, the withdrawal, the fear, the way she flinched when Stearns entered a room. But they also know that children like Madeline are taught not to speak. They are taught that silence is survival. They are taught that the adults in their lives won't believe them, won't protect them, won't save them. And sometimes they're right. Madeline Soto's bedroom still exists. The house where she lived, where she was abused, where she spent her last night before being driven to her death. It looks like any other bedroom. Posters on the walls, stuffed animals on the bed, a desk where she did homework, a window that looks out onto a quiet street. But if you stand in that room long enough, if you let yourself feel the weight of what happened there, you realize that it was never a bedroom. It was a crime scene. For years. And no one knew. That's the part that keeps investigators awake at night. Not the murder itself, as horrific as it was. But the years before. The countless nights when Madeline lay in that bed, knowing what was coming, unable to stop it, unable to escape. The years when she was dying slowly, invisibly, while the world went on around her. Stephen Stearns will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never touch another child. He will never have access to the internet, to technology, to the tools he used to document his crimes. He will grow old in a cell, surrounded by other predators, in a system that offers no redemption for crimes like his. But Madeline Soto will never grow old. She will never graduate high school. She will never fall in love. She will never have children of her own. She will never have the chance to heal from what was done to her, to reclaim her life, to become the person she might have been if Stephen Stearns had never entered her world. She is frozen at 13, forever, and somewhere in evidence storage on 17 hard drives wrapped in old t-shirts. The documentation of her suffering remains. Proof that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it moves quietly, patiently, hiding behind a smile and a helpful gesture and the word family. Sometimes it lives upstairs while everyone else sleeps. Asterisk. If you want more psychological true crime narrations like this, subscribe for the next case. Asterisk.